Hi. I beg your pardon, citizens. Here I was standing by the window to enjoy not only the beauty of the Blue Ridge in the distance, but also to savor it with this fine glass of wine. And rest assured, I would certainly not drink alone, particularly when I know that good friends and acquaintances are visiting with us once again. So please, if you will, allow me to pour for you here today some of my favorite wines, which are predominantly from the former Kingdom of France. It was there that I became most familiar with the French wines under the old regime, you might say. And that is the subject of our conversation today, if you will allow a discussion once more on wine. I say once more because we visited about a year ago and spoke about my efforts to cultivate wine here at our Monticello. And so once again, I welcome you to our Monticello, the unwritten code of Virginia hospitality, to welcome anyone on the road to come visit whenever you choose. And we are blessed today once again to have Ms. Alice Wagner with us to engage your questions and put forth your curiosities. So allow us to hear from her with respect to you, if you will allow me firstly to be seated. Well, thank you. My pleasure indeed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We quite enjoyed our conversation with you on wine last year, so it's a subject we wish to return to. Particularly, we want to speak with you further on your promotion of cultivating new tastes in wine in our nation. And we'd like to know more about your travels through Europe, which helped to influence your taste in wine. Did you have any knowledge or experience in foreign wines before you sailed to France?
Oh, my. I was privileged to have certain information about the finest wines that could be procured in the civilized world at that time. And I'm speaking, when I say civilized, of what were considered to be the European kingdoms. Yes, I had the opportunity to taste very fine French wines when I was invited to the table of Governor Francis Fauquier, one of the former royal governors of the colony of Virginia. Now, as the name may imply, Fauquier, he was of French descent. In fact, I believe his great-grandfather was born and brought up in the Kingdom of France. And so Governor Fauquier provided at his table not only some of the most elegant cuisine, that is, of French recipes, but also French wine. Now, this was a privilege because we were the colonies of Great Britain. And we could not trade directly with the Kingdom of France or any kingdom of Europe north of the Cape of Finisterre in Spain. So all of our wines had to come through England. Now, you may ask, England? What sort of wine was England cultivating? Well, one, Madeira. And Madeira is a wine, but it's a fortified wine. It's a wine that is made of so many varieties that all together are fortified. The reason, of course, to provide a heavy wine, often sweet, at the table. Port might be presumed in kind, but also for exportation. Yes, England would export Madeiras, particularly to the colonies, and they'd have to be fortified in Porto and the Madeira Islands, let alone the Canaries. So though I grew up always able to procure and to enjoy a fine Madeira, it was at Governor Fauquier's that I had the opportunity to enjoy very elegant and light French wine.
When you landed in France, you went straight to Paris. Can you tell us what you experienced there in terms of wine drinking?
Oh, my. Wine every day. Elegant wine every day. The French, of course, they cultivate their civilities with allowing wine to be served at the table amongst their young'un. So the French are brought up with an appreciation of fine wine. And the fine wines are the table wines throughout all of France, but particularly in Paris. You're able to experience and to enjoy what I consider one of the finest table wines, finest everyday wines that anyone could enjoy, a Bellet wine, B-E-L-L-E-T. It is cultivated from, just west of Nice, but it has the opportunity to travel a short distance to be provided at the tables in Parisian restaurants. Now, that is not to deny at these restaurants that you could enjoy as well a Margaux from Bordeaux, a Lafite, Latour from Bordeaux, or a Montrachet, if you will, from Bourgogne. Now, I beg your pardon here, I'm merely divulging names, perhaps without a sense of what the wine could be like. Well, as I mentioned earlier, light and elegant. If it is a red wine, such as Haut-Brion, it is still somewhat light and elegant, almost a claret. And if it is from Burgundy, if you will, and a white wine, which are those wines cultivated in the southern part of Burgundy, such as Merceau or Montrachet, well, again, they would be very light and elegant white wines. So these were the wines that you could enjoy at some of the old French restaurants in Paris. I speak of Le Precope, Le Grand Verfort. Le Grand Verfort is where you would go, an elegant French restaurant in the Palais Royal, before you would attend to see the theater, the Italian theater, Commedia Italiana. And you could enjoy these wines at that delightful restaurant. They consider it one of the oldest in Paris, à la petite chaise. À la petite chaise, the teeny chair. And there as well to enjoy a very elegant Bordeaux or a very elegant Burgundy, be it white or red.
From Paris, you traveled and visited vineyards throughout France. And how and where did you travel, and what did you learn on those journeys?
Well, the purpose, to tell the truth, for my travels to the south of France was to alleviate excruciating pains that I received when I fell and broke my right wrist. That was in Paris, and the story I have related earlier, and I'd be happy to tell it at another time. But the purpose is wine. And therefore, having been told the best place to alleviate the pain of a broken wrist was in the thermal baths at Aix-en-Provence. So having learned a bit about the French art and the cultivating of wine, both initially from Dr. Franklin, who was in France before me, and through many of the gentlemen Dr. Franklin introduced me to, particularly in the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, because I can assure you that many of the gentlemen, particularly of the aristocracy and nobility in France, were well acquainted with the finest wines. And they considered a few to be the finest that you could ever procure through Burgundy and Bordeaux. So with that in mind, I decided to set out and to investigate the actual vineyards. Now, because I was commissioned minister plenipotentiary of our nation at the court of Louis XVI, meaning all potentiary powers, I had to be cautious about how I traveled. So I made an effort to travel incognito. I would often travel in a post-chaise, and I would wear somewhat of a cloak with a hood. I had a carriage driver who served as valet. His name was Monsieur Petit Jean, Little John. And so we first set out to go through Burgundy, Bourgogne. And it was there, having heard what the finest wines were considered to be from gentlemen in Paris, I was able to actually venture into the vineyards of Merceau and Montrachet. And before that, in the north part, at Pommard and Volney, Clos Vougeot, a fascinating vineyard. Clos Vougeot established by monks going generations back into the medieval ages. The reason I say this is because visiting the actual vineyards, speaking with the vigneron, that is the farmer, or the monks, whomever it may be who are cultivating this wine, helps acquaint you precisely with the term I've only known in France, terroir, the terroir of cultivating wine. Now, this is something you do not necessarily learn from the middleman, the merchant, if you will, who comes between the vigneron and the cultivating of wine and the purchaser of that wine to whom he sells. No, you hear this distinctly from the vigneron. And the terroir is that unique cultivation altogether of the composition of the soil, the degree of climate, the altitude, the precipitation throughout the entire year in that particular hectare, or those few hectares of the vineyard. And I say this precisely because each vineyard, though close one to the other, and you see this venturing through Bourgogne perhaps better than anywhere else, that 20-mile distance produces a different wine. And the vignerons have come to understand one generation after the next the precise time that the terroir is want to eke out, if you will allow, from that grape, that special wine, unique unto that vineyard. You know, I noticed something else, that in the north of Burgundy, they cultivate predominantly the red wines. I mentioned them, Pommard and Volnay and Clos Vougeot, whereas in the southern part of Burgundy, towards the end of that 20-mile distance, they cultivate the white wines. Well, I noticed that in the north of Burgundy, they feed their laborers a very elegant white bread. But in the southern part of Burgundy, they feed their laborers a somewhat coarse rye bread. Now, the reason for this simply is because it is the red wines of Burgundy that are more easily exported, not only throughout the Kingdom of France and the kingdoms of Europe, but happily now to us here in our nation. The white wines spoil too readily. And as far as I know, they are not yet successful for us to import to our nation. So imagine within a 20-mile distance, only 20 miles, the fate of a laborer's livelihood and health rest upon what they are paid or fed for their labors. So this was one of my very first acquaintance with the cultivation of wine, with viticulture, as I traveled southwards, ultimately to Avignon. Had the opportunity there at Avignon to taste Chateauneuf de Pape. Oh, a wonderful wine, red wine that had been cultivated by monks as well for many, many centuries. And then finally down to the south of France to enjoy some of the wines, as I mentioned, Belay earlier, or L'Hermitage, if you will, in Provence. And they are basically, and for the most part, white wines that are provided in Provence. And I will tell you, they have come to be some of my favorite wines, but you have to be on the spot there in the south of France to thoroughly enjoy them.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, Anna would like to know if you enjoy any sparkling wines in France.
I certainly do, and so did His Excellency General Washington. I'm referring, of course, to Champagne. Champagne cultivated predominantly through the Champagne region, in and around Reims. Now, here's the most fascinating thing is I visited there, not far from Strasbourg, where I visited and tasted some of the finest wines of Alsace-Lorraine. But in Champagne, the French themselves, the residents there, the farmers and the vineyards there, have long enjoyed and drink predominantly a flat white wine, non-mousseau, meaning non-gaseous. This is the wine that they enjoy upon the table. However, particularly at Moet et Chandon, there in around Reims, there they cultivate a gaseous wine, mousseau wine. Now, the reason for this is because it is the gaseous white wine, the mousseau white wine, the champagne, as we call it, which the French are able to export. That survives the journey, mousseau wine. And so there you have one of the elements of preserving a white wine to the delight of General Washington and myself. So think of that when you think of the French ingenuity in viticulture to enjoy, as they always have, a flat white wine, nonetheless elegant, but the mousseau or gaseous wine is what they always sell, as we know, for a premium.
Donna would like to know if you have also traveled to vineyards in Spain and Italy.
No, I unfortunately have never been able to travel to Spain. I would very much appreciate that opportunity. Someday, I'm hopeful, someday. And remember, this information and the object of my curiosity and observations and notations has always been for the benefit of our country. And I say that before proceeding any further, because I came to understand when I was there living in France, and particularly throughout 5 delightful years, that wine is a decided necessity of life, particularly with me. It can be a panacea for ailments, and who would ever deny is conducive to good conversation. And consider this, as I discovered, no nation is drunken where wine is readily available, nor is one sober where wine is dear. That is simply because people do not become dependent upon harsh liquors, poisonous liquors, beyond the medicinal purposes. So this is what I hope to provide for our nation with the opportunity, if I may, to travel to Spain someday. But I was able to endeavor to lift the taste of our countrymen when I traveled through the Italies. Now, mind you, I keep this somewhat softly and quiet, because I was not really, you might say, commissioned or licensed to travel through the Italies, as I was minister plenipotentiary to the court of Louis XVI in France. But I went into the Italies more or less at the behest of the Agricultural Society of South Carolina, to pursue what had been known as a very elegant long-grain white rice. So traveling from Menton along the Riviera of France over 3 ranges of the Alps, and it took me a good 3 days finally to come down into Coney, and from Coney to Turin, and Turin to Milan. Well, there I became very familiar with the wines of the Piedmont, and in particular Montepulciano, a delicious red wine, Montepulciano, Barolo, the Barolo wine, and the Nebbiolo grape, the Nebbiolo. The Nebbiolo, perhaps more than the other two, was the table wine that I enjoyed throughout the Italies, and I still favor Nebbiolo. So yes, I became very familiar with the wines of the Italies while I was there.
What foreign wines have you served at Monticello and while you were in the president's house?
I'm almost hesitant to tell you after the long expose I've just related, but for the most part, Madeira, and you may well understand because it was more easily imported, and we continued to drink Madeira after the American Revolution. However, yes, I would often serve between Bordeaux and Burgundy, the Burgundy wines. More than Bordeaux. Now, that's not to say on special occasions I would welcome a dignitary or a good friend with a bottle of Haut-Briand or Margaux, Lafite, Latour, those vineyards in and around Bordeaux. But it was, for the most part, the red wines of Burgundy, Pommard and Voley, and Clos Vougeot that I would serve. Every once in a great while, yes, I would try to slip in a delicious Nebbiolo there for the guests to enjoy. But though I spent a great deal of what was allotted me by Congress on wine, and remember, I was provided about $25,000 per annum. Not, someone mentioned the other day, was that your salary? I said, oh, good heavens, what is a salary? No, $25,000 per annum was Congress support of the entire executive branch of our government. So it was out of that $25,000 that I had to provide for the elegant dinners that I provided in the president's house, for the payment of secretaries and the like, and also for my family, let alone the maintenance of the president's house. But on occasions, I spent several thousands of dollars on wine alone. Can you imagine the value of wine? To be able to smooth political differences of opinion, to bring people round to delightful and enlightening conversation. As I said, always conducive to good conversation, but more so in matters of politics.
Another one of our guests, David, would like to know if enslaved people at Monticello had access to wine.
Yes, they certainly have had access to wine, and the enslaved for many generations have been able to engage it. Essentially, the muscat grapes, as I refer to them, those are the native vines in throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. Scuppernong, in particular, is a most delicious wine. It's a sweet wine, but it is something that we all have enjoyed, let alone the enslaved. And remember, too, viticulture in the former colony of Virginia and in the Carolinas and throughout the former colonies of Great Britain here in North America had already been known. There was an effort to cultivate wine very early on in the European settlements. And that was nonetheless in Virginia. In fact, a North Carolinian, his name, I believe, was Lawson, John Lawson. Came to reside in Virginia. I think he resided in Buckingham County, but a short distance from here. And he published a work. It was about the early 18th century. I think it was about 1709 on the subject of viticulture. But essentially, that was involving the native vines, as I mentioned beforehand. And again, long enjoyed by all of us, the enslaved as well as their owners. Beg your pardon.
Well, Judy would like to know, what times were meals served at Monticello, and when is the wine served in relation to those meals?
Well, Judy, I always try to provide wine at the table at dinner. And dinner comes about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course, we ring the dinner bell. I'm always there early in the dining room. We welcome anyone to the table that has come to visit. And though we enjoy a Virginia fare, always provided in the French fashion, then after the meal, we take off the table furniture, clear the cloth, and then we put down the carafe and serve the aforementioned wines that I mentioned. I served in the president's house. There is Madeira, but mind you, we often serve cider with the meal. The cider is usually provided during the meal. But afterwards, Madeira, and then bottles that I've been able to import from Burgundy, only the red wines, as I mentioned earlier, Primard and Volney, some Sangiovese. Oh, it's a very fine grape indeed. And then often a bottle of Haut-Briand or Margaux or Latour. And yes, a sparkling champagne every once in a while. So this is always to be provided at the meal table. And of course, when many people wonder, well, Mr. Jefferson, how many glasses do you allow yourself? Well, by doctor's orders, I drink 2 glasses of wine a day. Now, when I'm with good friends and family, well, I treble that. But then remember, my glasses are only about 3 ounces. And at times, if the wine is a bit strong in its spirits, well, then I'll cut it with water. So only at the dinner is wine served then after the meal.
You mentioned earlier cultivation of vineyards here in the Americas. Bridget would like to know, do you think American wines will ever rival European wines?
American wines rival European wines? Oh, mercy, I should be cautious because, as you heard me refer earlier, I enjoy so much of the French wines. Why not, Bridget? Why can our wine not someday supersede the finest wines from about the world? You heard me say earlier that my intention in studying the viticulture, not only throughout France, but in the Italies as well, has been to raise the tastes of our countrymen, to place us, if you will, on a plateau with all of the world's foremost civilizations. And when I say raise the tastes of our countrymen, I'm meaning all of our countrymen, and that to improve from one generation after the next. So I do find, and have always thought, and many have commented as well, that the composition of our soil, particularly here in Virginia, the degree of altitude, our climate throughout the year, the extent of precipitation is just as good to be found anywhere amongst the kingdoms of Europe. And I mean not only France and the Germanys, but I would not discount Spain as well, and many other countries, to cultivate just as fine a wine. I'm hopeful that can happen. Unfortunately, at present, so long as our political economy here in Virginia and the Carolinas, many of our new southern states are dependent upon the production, well, I ask you, Ms. Bridget, what three most essential crops for the cultivation of political economy? I wonder if you perhaps and many others have answered correctly altogether. Yes, tobacco, tobacco, and tobacco. So until wine is a necessity, I fear that it will not be so successful. But in time, I'm hopeful that we may rise in competition with the wine-producing nations of the world. That is my hope. And of course, the future will always belong to the living generation.
Well, in that spirit of looking forward and celebrating, I have just found out that one of our viewers, Natalie Zaragoza, has been attending these sessions with you since your birthday of last year.
Oh, mercy, Miss Natalie, you make me feel aged. Well, is that not a blessing? But Miss Natalie, I will tell you this, with that recognition, having tended to our conversations, I have poured this for you. Now that, of course, means you must come to visit us here at Monticello. So I will hold this and welcome you to the table, and we can talk on about many, many other subjects of conversation. I think you've certainly witnessed over the year that not a blade of grass shoots uninteresting to me. So how much more delightful to discourse upon so many subjects when you have a glass of elegant wine to support you.
Well, just one last question, Mr. Jefferson. What role do you think you have played in expanding Americans' knowledge of wine and its tastes in wine drinking?
That's a very good question. I hope that I have provided a role, if you will, that the French provided us. A success in revolution. Mind you, never forget, the American Revolution would have never been successful without the aid of La Belle France. And I discovered while I was there in France that I personally engaged another revolution, a revolution recognizing the value of cultivating fine wine in our nation. So yes, I would consider that the future ought to see in our nation a revolution directed towards the further cultivation of wine, the successful cultivation of wine. You know, Dr. Franklin was known to make many statements that have somewhat been coined, not only in his Poor Richard's Almanac, but in conversation as I engaged with him many times. And it is said that he made a particular referral to beer. Well, I'm not going to discount the element of beer. We make beer here and we provide it at the table too. But he also made statement that wine is decidedly the example that God loves us. That is what I would like to see, to bring closer the family of man about the globe, that we can continue to visit one with the other, share what we have long known in providing more a sense of joie de vivre in our lives together, and that the family of man, always engaged with a fine glass of wine, may consider how best we can improve the condition of man for generations yet unborn. Well, Miss Natalie and all others, do come visit with us, and I look forward to the next occasion when we are all together to enjoy conversation. And next time, bring your own bottles. There's never too much wine to be provided for a gathering. And I look forward indeed to Ms. Alice Wagner joining us in the future. Well, I remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed.